hearing to order. This is our 10th day of the American Energy Initiative. We've had a series of hearings on the energy needs of the American people. And today we're going to turn our focus to a particularly important issue, and that's pipeline safety. Recent major pipeline accidents in San Bruno, California, Marshall, Michigan, and Allentown, Pennsylvania have thrust our attention on the nation's pipeline system and the regulations that ensure their safety. Today we hope to reconvene the dialogue that began last year with a similar hearing called in response to those accidents. And of course, the last time that pipeline safety was reauthorized was back in 2006, and it's time for us to revisit that as well. As some in this room might remember, our last pipeline safety authorization bill, as I said, was in 2006. We worked together in a lengthy bipartisan process that allowed us to pass the bill under suspension on the House floor. The PIPES Act expired in December of last year, but funding levels remain in place under the present continuing resolution. It is our intention to craft a pipeline safety bill that enhances current authorities and can provide greater protection for our infrastructure, communities, and the environment. This process begins today with this hearing. We have wide and a variety of interests represented on the witness panel, and I look forward to hearing their perspective on all of these issues. With the information and discussion provided today, committee members can get the proper context for the issues we will work together on later this summer. Although the major accidents mentioned earlier should be a part of today's dialogue, I'm sure we will not rush to any conclusion before the National Transportation Safety Board completes its investigations. We've been told this will not happen for several months or possibly even next year. Before we write laws or push for regulations that explicitly address those accidents, we should wait until all the facts are in. Until that time, there are several areas where pipeline safety can and should be improved, which we can get moving in the very near future. It is my belief that members from both sides of the aisle can find a common purpose on these issues and work together to produce effective and meaningful legislation that protects the public and the environment. And at this point, I would like to recognize Mr. Waxman for purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member of the subcommittee, Congressman Rush, was unable to be here at the beginning of this hearing because the time had been changed and he had already made a previous engagement, but I understand he'll be given a chance to make an opening statement when he arrives. It's clear we need to pay serious attention to pipeline safety. Experts have been warning of the hazards of deteriorating infrastructure in this country, and natural gas and hazardous material pipelines are a prime example. There's been a burst of new construction in the last few years, which puts further stress on pipeline safety oversight resources. The system is showing clear signs of strain, and people and the environment are paying the price. Here is what we've seen over the past year and a half. 2 natural gas pipeline explosions that killed 13 people and damaged over 150 homes and businesses. A spill of over 800,000 gallons of diluted bitumen, a heavy tar-like substance from the Canadian tar sands into the Kalamazoo River. 30 miles of the river are expected to remain closed over a year after the spill, and cleanup costs are estimated at over $500 million. A second spill of over 250,000 gallons from the same pipeline 6 weeks later. 12 spills on the new Keystone pipeline in its first year of operation. This pipeline also carries diluted bitumen. Most of these spills were small, but after 2 large ones, FSMA shut down the pipeline, finding that continued operation without corrective action would be hazardous to life, property, and the environment. A trench collapse for the new Bison natural gas pipeline in Montana, leaving fissures 3 to 4 feet deep and hundreds of feet long. In addition, FSMA recently found that some steel pipe produced between 2007 and 2009 was defective. 5 of the 7 pipelines FSMA investigated contained the defective pipe, which had to be replaced, but other pipelines may also have used it. There is no current requirement for them to test for defective steel pipe. These pipeline incidents are tragic, and we must act to prevent more loss of life and property in the future. These incidents are the canary in the coal mine, warning about the state of our pipeline safety. We may pay a very high price for ignoring these warnings. We need to make sure that we are anticipating and preventing these pipeline safety disasters before they occur. In particular, oil companies are rapidly and dramatically expanding the quantity of tar sands crude in the form of diluted bitumen, but that they are moving through pipelines in this country. Concerns have been raised that diluted bitumen poses a greater risk, both in terms of the likelihood of spills and the challenges of cleanup. We need to understand these risks and address them, and we need to do that before approving another tar sands pipeline, not after a pipeline is built with inadequate protections. Yet just yesterday, this subcommittee moved legislation to short-circuit the approval process for the newest tar sands pipeline before holding this hearing. That legislation is a mistake. We should understand the unique safety concerns for tar sands pipelines, not accelerate pipeline approval. We've had a history of bipartisan action on pipeline safety, and there's a lot of room for agreement in this area. I look forward to working with the Republican majority on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman, and when Mr. Rush does arrive, we will give him an opportunity to make his opening statement. This time I'd like to recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. For years, pipeline safety has been a topic that enjoys bipartisan cooperation and produces very effective legislation. The last time this committee took up legislation on this subject, we were able to pass the bill under suspension on the House floor, and as the 2006 law expires, it is our responsibility to put forward meaningful legislation this summer that will improve pipeline safety and allow our pipeline infrastructure to remain a dynamic and efficient method for transporting vital energy supplies. The first step in the process is certainly today's broad survey of the world of pipeline safety. We have with us all the major stakeholders and experts, as well as the lead regulator on pipeline safety. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration is an effective enforcer of this nation's pipeline regulations and laws, and I look forward to hearing how their processes, authorities, resources could be enhanced with legislation in the future, as well as how the companies and interests represented at the witness table today believe that their industry could be rendered even safer. Pipelines are the safest method of transporting hazardous liquids and natural gas. The incident rate is extraordinarily small, but when things do go wrong, they go wrong in a big way, that's for sure. And I do not have to look too far for an example of this, as 20,000 barrels of oil spilled out of a ruptured line into a tributary of the Kalamazoo River, just one county outside of my district last year. I was aggressive in my efforts to get the spill cleaned up and the environment restored, but when it comes to policy changes, we cannot focus only on the response to a spill. We also have to focus on preventing pipeline safety failures before they happen. The overall strong safety record of hazardous liquid and natural gas pipelines can be marred by isolated failures that put human life, property, and the environment at risk. Pipeline safety is an issue that we all take very seriously, and I've let it be known that this committee is certain to move on a bipartisan reauthorization bill later this summer. Our goal should be to craft an effective bill that ensures another community doesn't experience a spill that affects their waterways or a massive explosion that levels a neighborhood. This hearing will give members a broad view of the status of the pipeline safety laws and regulations and will inform us of what might be the best path forward as we craft legislation. I look very forward to the discussion that we're going to host today and the ideas that will be proposed. I want to particularly thank the Administrator for Pipeline Safety, Ms. Quarterman, for her graciousness for allowing us to have one panel instead of two, as we are expecting about 3 hours of votes in about an hour. So we're able to hopefully get this adjourned before that starts, so that because I'm not sure how many people are going to come back after 3 o'clock, and I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that opportunity to thank all of our witnesses for being here. And certainly, just like our national interstate system, we want to design it so it's as safe as possible to travel on. Our pipeline system is critical to our energy infrastructure. And as we know, as Mr. Upton said, and Ranking Member Waxman mentioned, is that sometimes there are problems. An explosion in San Bruno, California, that killed, I think, 8 people. Incident in Arizona a couple years ago. So as Fred said, when something goes bad, it can really have devastating effects on loss of life. So we need to get it as close to perfect as we can. So your testimony here will help do that. I do want to add to Mr. Waxman's comments about the Trans-Canadian pipeline. I think after 3 years of reviewing it and sitting on a 1.5 foot environmental impact studies and supplementals, that it's time for them to start action in the State Department and make a decision. So I don't think it was hasty or irresponsible at all. In fact, I think the irresponsible is the foot dragging by our agencies on several energy projects. With that, I will yield back.
Would you yield to me?
I will not yield back. I'm going to yield to Mr. Burgess.
And I appreciate you yielding me a generous amount of time. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to insert my entire statement into the record. But I live in an area of Texas where there is a very complex and complicated network of natural gas pipelines above the Barnett Shale. I just want to point out that not all regulations need to be at the federal level. The consortium of mayors got together in my area and collaborated on a pipeline best practices guideline. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit that for the record.
Without objection.
And I'll yield back Mr. Terry's time.
You went over 16 seconds. Well, that concludes the opening statements except for Mr. Rush's, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being with us today, and also we appreciate your flexibility in allowing us to change the time of the starting of the hearing. And with us today, we have Ms. Cynthia Quarterman, who is the administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration at the Department of Transportation. We have Mr. Andy Black, who is president of the Association of Oil Pipelines, and on behalf of the American Petroleum Institute as well. We have Mr. Carl Weimer, who's the executive director of the Pipeline Safety Trust. We have Mr. Christopher Helms, who is the executive vice president and group CEO of NiSource Gas Transmission and Storage, and also on behalf of the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. We have Mr. Charles Dippo, who's Vice President, Engineering Services and System Integrity for South Jersey Gas Company, and also on behalf of the American Gas Association. And we have Mr. Anthony Swift, who is the Energy Analyst for International Programs at the Natural Resources Defense Council. So thank you for being with us. All of you have a great deal of expertise in this area, which we know will be beneficial for us. And each one of you will be given 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement. And there is a little device there that will say green when it's time to go, yellow when think about stopping, and red. We hope you might stop at that point. But we do look forward to your testimony. And at this time, Ms. Quarterman, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today to discuss the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration's oversight of America's vast network of energy pipelines. Safety is the #1 priority of Secretary LaHood, myself, and the employees of PHMSA, and we are strongly committed to reducing transportation risks to the public and the environment. More than 2.5 million miles of pipelines across the nation, deliver energy to homes and businesses, connect communities, and support our way of life. PHMSA's role in ensuring the safety of each and every mile of these pipelines is vital. To get the job done, we develop and enforce regulations and maintain strong partnerships with states who oversee most of the intrastate pipelines. Through strong regulations and integrity management programs, PHMSA has significantly reduced accidents and increased accountability for managing the risks of pipeline operations. Serious pipeline incidents have dropped by more than half over the past 20 years. However, we still have much work to do. In the wake of several recent serious pipeline incidents, PHMSA is taking a hard look at the nation's pipelines. The pipeline infrastructure needs more attention to help ensure it will continue to meet the huge demand later generations will place on it to meet America's energy delivery needs. In April, Secretary LaHood and I developed an action plan requiring pipeline stakeholders to act, to be aggressive, and be transparent in charting a course to accelerate the identification, repair, rehabilitation, and replacement of high-risk pipeline infrastructure. As part of our action plan, we've brought together everyone with a role in pipeline safety to engage in discussions. We've also met with government, industry executives, pipeline employees representatives, states, and the public interest community to discuss the actions all pipelines can take to raise the safety bar. While we continue to think about next steps, PHMSA looks forward to working with Congress on the reauthorization of its pipeline safety program. While previous reauthorizations have helped to advance pipeline safety by providing additional resources to better exercise the Department's enforcement authority, enhance protection through integrity management requirements for distribution pipelines, and increase support for state pipeline safety agencies, we still need to do more. Pipeline safety could be greatly improved with the passage of reforms pushing stronger enforcement authority, expanded integrity management requirements beyond those areas where there are existing high consequence areas, improved pipeline data collection, and by advancing safety in many other ways. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify before this subcommittee and report on PHMSA's oversight role of pipelines and the opportunities that exist to strengthen oversight. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
No, thank you, Ms. Quarterman. And at this time, Mr. Black, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. I appreciate the opportunity to appear on behalf of AOPL and API. Pipelines have long been the safest way to move crude oil and refined petroleum products, such as gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, home heating oil, and propane. Pipelines are also the most reliable and efficient way to move these fuels, which American consumers and workers depend upon to sustain our economy and our quality of life. The safety record of the liquid pipeline industry shows strong improvement over the past decade. There are significantly fewer pipeline accidents and less volume released of product than 10 years ago because of new laws and regulations, vigorous company actions, and improving technologies. Each of the major causes of pipeline accidents also showed marked decreases during this time period, reflecting the success of strategies to manage risks better. Pipeline operators have every incentive to invest in safety. Most important is the potential for injury to members of the public, our employees, our contractors, and effects upon the environment. Operators could incur costly cleanups, repairs, litigations, and fines, and a pipeline may not be able to provide service to its customers if a facility needs to be shut down. Operators of liquid pipelines invest millions of dollars annually to maintain their pipelines and comply with safety laws and regulations. One survey of a group of members showed that $3.3 billion was spent on integrity management activities in just the past 6 years. These costs will only increase as integrity management tools become more expensive, more differentiated, and more effective at identifying issues for operators to address. These costs are ultimately borne by the shippers who pay for transportation services and the consumers of products that are shipped through the pipeline. Operators work hard to learn from pipeline incidents and share ideas and improvements for best practices. The industry has standing teams and workshops to assess integrity management issues, review incidents and near misses, analyze data, and make technically based recommendations to industry leaders. The industry invests in R&D to develop new technologies and practices to confront pipeline challenges and pushes technology vendors to do the same. We continue to work very hard at the company and association level to achieve the goal of zero releases. Congress has provided PHMSA with broad authority to regulate pipeline safety. PHMSA is an aggressive regulator, conducting rigorous inspections and vigorously enforcing compliance with pipeline safety laws. PHMSA has the tools and uses them when necessary. Operators face a comprehensive set of requirements for construction, operation, and maintenance of a pipeline. Regulations cover everything from design standards to operational controls, qualification of personnel, public awareness, infrastructure and incident reporting, emergency response, and much more. While we do not yet have the final results of investigations into recent high-profile pipeline accidents, it's important to note that existing laws and regulations already address the leading causes of pipeline failure, including corrosion, materials and equipment failures, and operations errors. If investigations unexpectedly identify any gaps, we are ready to work with you to address them. We were pleased to see the Senate Commerce Committee advance pipeline safety reauthorization S-275, which passed the committee unanimously. The bill is a positive step forward, although we do not agree with every provision. My written testimony covers a number of recommendations. We call to your attention Section 3, which would essentially require PHMSA to prohibit one-call exemptions for state and local governments and their contractors. It is a great start. We urge this committee and the House to go further by eliminating still more exemptions for mechanized excavators. Third-party damage is less frequent today, but is still the leading cause of accidents that kill or injure people. In some cases, state laws requiring the use of 811, the National Call Before You Dig number, exempt state agencies, municipalities, or other entities, such as railroads, from requirements to use the one-call system. These exemptions create a gap in enforcement and safety. The pipeline does not care who hits it. PHMSA can close the gap by exercising one-call civil enforcement authority granted by Congress in 2006. PHMSA can conduct enforcement proceedings for a one-call violation within the boundary of a state if the secretaries determine that the state's plan or enforcement is inadequate to protect safety. The draft PHMSA rulemaking on this issue is a great start, but does not go far enough on ending these exemptions. We urge DOT to complete its rulemaking soon and urge Congress to require PHMSA to terminate these exemptions. We also applaud the provision in S-275 to bring some of PHMSA's pipeline procedural rules up to par with those used by other regulatory agencies, including elsewhere at DOT. Requiring an impartial presiding officer to conduct hearings and allowing access to a hearing transcript are basic elements of due process we support. We encourage the Congress to go further by also requiring a separation of function of PHMSA staff to help ensure impartiality. Also, Congress should require PHMSA to allow timely hearings to review corrective action orders after they are issued. We're glad PHMSA may implement some of these safeguards administratively, but we note they are reversible unless codified by Congress. We look forward to working with Congress, PHMSA, the Pipeline Safety Trust, and others to continue pipeline safety gains and reauthorize the pipeline safety laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Mr. Weimer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Whitfield and Upton, and Ranking Member Waxman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today on the important subject of pipeline safety. The Pipeline Safety Trust came into being after a pipeline disaster in Bellingham, Washington that occurred 12 years ago, which left 3 young people dead, wiped out every living thing in a beautiful salmon stream, and caused millions of dollars of economic disruption. Born from that tragedy and other tragedies in places like Edison, New Jersey, Carlsbad, New Mexico, and Walnut Creek, California, we have testified to Congress for years about the improvements needed in regulations to help prevent more disasters. For years, we have talked about the need for more miles of pipelines to be inspected by smart pigs. We have pleaded for clear standards for leak detection and the placement of automated shutoff valves, closing the loopholes that allow some pipelines to remain unregulated, and for better information to be available so people know if they live near a large pipeline. So here we are again after new tragedies in Marshall, Michigan, San Bruno, California, and Allentown, Pennsylvania, asking for the same things we have asked for at other hearings following previous tragedies. We are pleased to see some of our recommendations included in part of the legislation recently passed unanimously by the Senate Commerce Committee, and we hope this body will build on that legislation to provide an even stronger, more comprehensive bill. It is our sincere desire not to be back here again in the future saying the same things after yet another disaster. Pipeline safety should be an easy task. The pipeline industry, regulators, and citizen groups all agree that safety is job one. Every trade association has come out with some statement that the highest priority is no deaths, no injuries, 0 incidents. So if we all agree that zero incidents is the goal, then let's look at what changes in the rules can get us to zero. Clearly, providing PHMSA and the states with more funding and personnel so they can better inspect industry efforts and analyze safety needs should move us towards zero incidents, so we all should support that. Since integrity management requirements were passed nearly 10 years ago, more than 34,000 flaws were found in pipelines and repaired, reducing the possibilities of many failures. Since 75% of all the deaths caused by the failures of transmission pipelines have occurred in areas that fall outside of the current integrity management requirements, and only 7% of gas pipelines and only 44% of liquid pipelines fall under these inspection requirements, it is clear we could reduce incidents by requiring integrity management inspections on all miles of these pipelines. We are glad that INGA, in their recently released new set of guiding principles, commits to, quote, applying integrity management principles on a system-wide basis, unquote. Likewise, any pipelines near people should be required to operate in such a way that prevents failures. Unfortunately, with the rapid expansion of new shale gas drilling in more populated areas, there are now hundreds of thousands of miles of gas gathering lines that are under-regulated or not regulated at all. Many of these lines are the same size and pressure as transmission pipelines. Clearly, if our priority is safety, then these gathering lines need to fall under the same safety regulations as other similar pipelines. If zero is our goal, then state agencies need to continue to be pushed to improve their pipeline damage prevention laws, and the efforts of state pipeline safety agencies need to be clearly evaluated and those evaluations shared with the public. If safety is our highest priority, then the disconnect that exists between the agencies that site new pipelines and PHMSA, the agency in charge of pipeline safety, needs to be corrected. PHMSA needs to have the authority and the resources necessary to engage in safety reviews as these pipelines are planned and to inspect them thoroughly as they are going into the ground. And if getting to zero incidents is really our priority, then local governments who have zoning and permitting authority regarding land uses near pipelines need to be engaged actively in these pipeline safety discussions, since more and more development is encroaching near these big pipelines. NTSB's recommendation that companies can clearly document that the operating pressure they run their transmission pipelines at is based on real knowledge of what is in the ground needs to be adopted. Also, requirements for excess flow valve installation on appropriate multifamily and commercial applications needs to be moved forward. I see my time is about up, so let me close by saying that there are many things that clearly can be done to make pipelines safer. We have outlined many of those specific ideas in our written testimony. Many of the leaks, spills, and injuries and deaths that are still occurring are preventable. Instead of just saying getting to zero is our highest priority, we all need to start doing things that will actually get us there. You have the opportunity this year with this legislation to help guide us all towards zero incidents. We hope you seize that opportunity and help hold us all to our fine talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Helms. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the committee. My name is Chris Helms. I'm CEO of NiceHorse Gas Transmission and Storage and Chairman of the INGA Board Task Force on Pipeline Safety. NiceHorse operates more than 15,000 miles of natural gas transmission pipelines extending from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast. Today I'm testifying on behalf of INGA, the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. INGA represents the nation's interstate natural gas transmission pipeline industry, and as seen on slide number 1, our members operate a 200,000-mile network of large-diameter pipelines that transport natural gas throughout the nation. I'd like to state at the outset that while the safety record of the natural gas transmission system is very strong, we recognize that continuous improvement is imperative. And we want to work with you and other stakeholders to achieve our primary goal of zero pipeline incidents. Demand for natural gas is growing, and as a result, maintaining the public trust in pipeline safety is critical. Slide 2 shows the interstate natural gas transmission pipelines that have been approved for construction by the FERC over the past decade. Due to the growing demand for domestic shale gas, gas pipeline infrastructure has expanded significantly and will likely continue to grow. Ensuring the safe and reliable operation of these systems will remain critical and is the highest priority for this industry. As part of the Pipeline Safety Improvement Act of 2002, natural gas transmission pipeline operators are required to implement an integrity management program. Integrity management is a strategic, risk-based approach that focuses on identifying and mitigating risk in populated areas. The program requires continual pipeline assessments and the repair and remediation of any potential safety problems that are found. The vast majority of baseline assessments under the program are nearing completion. Consistent with the schedule established by Congress, while only 4.5% of INGA member pipeline miles are located in populated areas covered under the program, baseline assessments have been completed on more than 50% of the pipeline miles to date. With the first round of assessments almost complete, we believe now is an ideal time to reflect upon the effectiveness of this program. Last year, the INGA board established a senior-level task force and then adopted clear guiding principles to define and lead our industry to improved safety performance. Our 5-point principles are outlined in slide 3 as follows. Our goal is zero incidents, a perfect record of safety and reliability for the national pipeline system. We will continue to work every day towards this goal. We are committed to safety culture as a critical dimension to continuously improving our industry's performance. Third, we'll be relentless in our pursuit of improving by learning from the past and anticipating the future. Fourth, we are committed to applying integrity management principles on a system-wide basis, as Mr. Weimer said. And last, we will engage our stakeholders from the local community to the national level so they understand and can participate in reducing risk. To translate these principles into action, the task force has commissioned an initiative we call Integrity Management Continuous Improvement. Our objective is to assess our performance, identify lessons learned, and target areas in need of improvement. Action plans have been developed and teams are already working in key areas to move us towards achieving our goal of zero incidents. In light of recent pipeline incidents, it's important to reassess our infrastructure and better characterize the conditions that contribute to pipeline failures. A pipeline fails when its conditions deteriorate, our service environment changes to a point where the pipeline is no longer fit for service. To achieve zero incidents, our focus must remain on that standard. Any pipeline not fit for service, regardless of age, should be repaired, replaced, or retired. Older pipelines can remain fit for service if operating conditions are controlled and the pipeline is properly maintained. On the other hand, even the newest pipelines can be susceptible to failure due to threats like excavation damage or outside forces. Age is an important consideration, but it is only one indicator of a pipeline's fitness for service. Pipeline safety is a shared responsibility which requires close cooperation among all stakeholders. We are actively engaged in critical call before you dig programs, and as you can see this morning, I'm wearing the 811 call before you dig pin. We're working with local governments to educate them about development around existing pipelines. We're working with first responders to train emergency personnel on how to prevent and respond to natural gas pipeline emergencies. Our efforts to engage our stakeholders are numerous, and this interaction is critical to achieving our goal of zero incidents. In drafting a reauthorization bill, INGA believes that legislation recently approved by the Senate Commerce Committee provides a good framework to follow. I see that my time is about up, so Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to say in closing is we hope that Congress will complete reauthorization of a bill this year and view the progress being made in that regard as encouraging. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Dippo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am Charles Dippo, Vice President of South Jersey Gas and Chairman of the American Gas Association Operating Section. I am here testifying today on behalf of AGA, which represents 200 local energy companies that deliver clean natural gas to more than 64 million customers throughout the United States. Industry has demonstrated it can increase the delivery of natural gas while continuously improving safety. Data from PHMSA shows serious incidents and leaks have been reduced by nearly 50% over the last 20 years, but clearly more needs to be done. The tragic incident in San Bruno reminds us that one accident is too many. The NTSB has not issued a final report on the San Bruno incident, but the industry is already taking away important lessons from the information that has been produced thus far in the extensive investigation. The factual reports show that the event appears to be an isolated incident with no evidence of national systemic safety problems. Nevertheless, pipeline operators are assessing their systems to determine if the circumstances encountered in San Bruno bear any similarity to their operations. The pipeline industry leadership has joined Transportation Secretary LaHood in his call to action to repair, replace, or rehabilitate the highest risk infrastructure and to raise the bar on pipeline safety. How do we raise the bar on pipeline safety? First, we must keep our focus on key initiatives that are showing success. This includes distribution and transmission integrity management, control room management, public awareness, excavation damage prevention, and voluntary initiatives such as AGA's Best Practices Program. Second, we have an opportunity to enhance safety through better excavation damage prevention programs, establishing a data quality committee, reducing hurdles to implementing new technology, adopting the latest consensus standards, and enhancing pipeline safety legislation. One key safety initiative is distribution integrity management. This comprehensive regulation provides an added layer of protection to the already strong safety programs executed by distribution companies. Operators are given until August 2011 to write and begin implementation of their individual risk-based programs and are already aggressively implementing this rule. Excess flow valves, EFVs, have another added layer of safety. AGA supported the 2006 congressional mandate, and most operators were voluntarily installing EFVs well before the congressional deadline. However, due to the inherent uncertainties and complexities associated with service lines to multiple family dwellings, commercial and industrial customers, it is inadvisable to attempt mandatory installation of EFVs beyond single-family homes. PHMSA should be given adequate time to finish its technical analysis and complete the final rulemaking process. Excavation damage represents the single greatest threat to gas distribution, safety, reliability, and integrity. AGA supports legislation that will require a state one-call program to have appropriate participation by all underground operators and excavators, including government entities, to have flexible and effective enforcement and prohibit exemption of municipalities, state agencies, or their contractors from the one-call requirements. AGA also believes pipeline safety can be improved through an independent review and analysis of the data collected by DOT. AGA recommends the creation of a data quality team that mirrors PHMSA's technical advisory committees. This team would analyze and approve upon the data collected by DOT, identify areas where the data tells us there's an opportunity to improve pipeline safety, and to communicate consistent messages about what the data is telling us. AGA supports continued funding of research, development, and deployment of new technologies, as well as the refinement of current technologies that are essential to improving pipeline safety. We recommend that emphasis be placed on deployment of new technologies and the reduction of regulatory barriers operators currently face when attempting to implement new technologies. The industry is presently restricted by federal pipeline safety regulations that require operators to follow obsolete standards as they relate to pipeline safety. AGA suggests that Congress consider legislation to require DOT to codify within 2 years the most recent edition of a standard that DOT has adopted into the Pipeline Safety Code. Finally, it has been suggested that the Transmission Integrity Management Program be changed to eliminate high-consequence areas, thus requiring integrity management assessments on all transmission pipelines. AGA believes this would be contrary to the intent Congress had for the program, which was to focus resources on areas where an accident could do the most damage. AGA believes it is reasonable for Congress to direct DOT to evaluate the effectiveness of Transmission Integrity Management Program within 2 years of the completion of the baseline assessments. This study could include evaluations of maximum allowable operating pressure, potential expansion of high-consequence areas, installation of remote or automatic shutoff valves, and expansion to areas of seismic activity. In conclusion, the natural gas industry has a strong safety record, and we are committed to working with all stakeholders to improve. To that end, we applaud this committee's focus on moving pipeline safety reauthorization forward. Passage of this important bill this year will help us achieve a common goal to enhance the safe delivery of this vital energy resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dippo. Mr. Swift, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the committee. I'm a policy analyst for Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting public health and the environment. As a personal note, coming from West Texas and a family with 4 generations in the oil and gas industry, I value the opportunity that allows me to participate in the critical process that ensures the industry's infrastructure is held to the highest standards of safety. Over the last few years, the U.S. hazardous liquid pipeline system has been used to transport a substance called diluted bitumen from the tar sands region of Canada. By itself, bitumen is virtually solid at room temperature. To move it through a pipeline, producers must dilute it with a light, highly volatile natural gas liquids. The thick, abrasive mixture, called diluted bitumen, is then pumped through pipelines at high pressure, generating enough friction to reach temperatures of up to 150 degrees. Over the last decade, imports of diluted bitumen have increased six-fold, yet regulators haven't moved to assess its risks, including both the potential for increased spill frequency as well as greater safety risks when those spills occur. The U.S. pipeline system may already be showing signs of strain. For example, pipelines in Midwestern states, which have the longest history of transporting Canadian tar sands crude, have spilled nearly 3 times more crude per mile than the national average over the last 4 years. Enbridge transports the majority of Canadian diluted bitumen to the United States. In 2010, its Lakehead system had over a dozen spills, accounting for more than half of all crude oil spilled in the United States that year. Meanwhile, TransCanada's Keystone Pipeline, one of the first pipelines dedicated to move tar sands crude from Canada to the United States, has had 12 leaks in less than 12 months of operation, the largest of which was approximately 21,000 gallons. Keystone is the newest liquid pipeline system to ever be deemed by PHMSA an immediate threat to life, property, and the environment. During a spill, natural gas liquids and diluted bitumen may increase the risk of explosion and exposure to toxic vapors. As the 840,000-gallon spill in Kalamazoo appears to have confirmed, in a spill, diluted bitumen behaves differently than conventional crude, requiring different, more expensive, and time-consuming cleanup methods than conventional crude oil spills. These are early warning signs that present a compelling case that more study is needed on the risks of diluted bitumen. Building TransCanada's Keystone XL, a high-pressure pipeline that would move up to 830,000 barrels per day of hot, corrosive diluted bitumen through the heart of the Ogallala Aquifer, creates hazards that a conventional crude oil pipeline does not. The Ogallala Aquifer is a critical source of fresh water for the United States. It provides 30% of our irrigation water and drinking water for millions of Americans. A spill in the deepest part of that aquifer, in the Nebraska Sandhills, could be a disaster. Given the limits of leak detection technology, which on a pipeline like Keystone XL could allow a leak of hundreds of thousands of gallons a day to go unnoticed, the worst case scenario is simply one we cannot afford. NRDC recommends the following actions. First, Congress should require PHMSA to conduct a detailed study of diluted bitumen. This study should include both the risks of increased spill frequency as well as unique hazards that such spills may pose to public safety and the environment. Second, PHMSA should be actively engaged in all stages of major pipeline infrastructure development. This includes issuing comments during environmental review for significant pipeline projects such as the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. It should be noted that it is the quality and not the time spent conducting environmental review that ensures the safety of new projects. Finally, Congress should direct PHMSA to develop necessary regulations to protect our major freshwater resources, like the Ogallala Aquifer, from pipeline spills. Under current pipeline safety regulations, aquifers like the Ogallala receive the lowest level of federal oversight. During the Gulf spill, we witnessed the sad consequences that come of allowing an accident-prone company to replace expensive but prudent safety measures with reckless optimism. Let us not court a similar disaster in the deepest waters of our nation's greatest aquifer. Once again, NRDC thanks you for the opportunity to present its views, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Swift, thanks very much, and at this time I would like to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Rush for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all the panelists for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I find it curious that this subcommittee is holding a hearing on pipeline safety after the majority pushed through a bill to cut out the review period for public and agency input in order to force the administration to hastily come to a decision regarding the Keystone XL pipeline on behalf of the TransCanada Corporation. Yes, this is the same TransCanada Corporation who built the original Keystone pipeline that was temporarily shut down following 2 leaks on a line that has only been in operation for less than 12 months. I might seriously question on which side the majority falls when it comes to actually ensuring pipeline safety versus accommodating the interests of corporate entities. So forgive me if it seems like this hearing is a day late and $1 short. when it comes to this subcommittee actually putting into practice whatever lessons we may learn here today, as it appears doubtful that the majority will allow safety concerns to interfere in the way of industry moving forward at all costs. Let it be said, I am not opposed to industry, but industry's pathway forward must not be oiled by this subcommittee. However, with that being said, I still believe that this hearing is warranted and necessary, and I am pleased to have heard some of the testimony from our distinguished experts and our witnesses on the panel. Mr. Chairman, in the past, pipeline safety has been an issue that this subcommittee has addressed in a bipartisan fashion. And despite yesterday's markup forcing a hasty decision on the Keystone XL pipeline, I hope that we will continue in that tradition in this session as well. In light of recent pipeline accidents, including Keystone 1 leaks, the PG&E explosion in San Bruno, California, the 2 Enbridge spills in Marshall, Michigan, and Romeo, Illinois, and the Allentown gas line explosion in Pennsylvania, it is extremely important that we learn from these cases so lessons can be applied to our overall pipeline safety standards. I look forward to this hearing, and I look forward to asking questions of these witnesses. And I look forward to asking questions of the Pipeline Hazardous Safety Materials and Safety Administration on their updated plans for safety transporting Tarzan's crude from Canada through the heart of the United States, including my state. These Tarzans contain bitumen, a heavy tar-like substance which, compared to conventional crude, has higher sulfur content, higher chloride salt content, and higher qualities of abrasive particles, all of which increases the potential for corrosion. I would also like to hear and ask questions on how PHMSA plans to address the issue of companies using substandard steel for their pipelines that do not comply with industry standards and in many cases lead to stretching and leakage. At a time when Congress and the administration is considering approval of one of the largest new pipeline projects in recent history, the Keystone XL, which will carry Canadian tar sands through the middle of the country, it is imperative that we examine these important issues and assure the American people that we have an effective and comprehensive plan in place to both prevent future spills as well as to deal with the accidents once they take place. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the questioning part of this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush, and I'll recognize myself for the purpose of 5 minutes of questionings. Ms. Quarterman, and in fact, for all the panel members, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Senate bill that's been working on over there. Would each one of you give me your succinct analysis of one or two of the major flaws of that legislation, or areas that should have been covered that is not in the bill? Ms. Quarterman.
Yes, thank you. The administration has not had an opportunity to come forward with an administration position on that particular bill. We have, in my testimony today, several administration proposals that the administration has been supportive of in the past. I don't know of anything in that bill that is necessarily a showstopper from our vantage point.
But is there any major item that they failed to cover?
I don't believe there is.
Mr. Bly?
No major flaws, Chairman Whitfield. AOPL and API supported the bill moving out of the committee. We hope the Senate will move it without change. and then work with the Congress that has considered its bill. We'd like it to go we'd like the Congress to go further on damage prevention, eliminating more
On damage
exemptions-
prevention?
damage preventions, exemptions from the one-call system in the states. We believe PHMSA should use its authority, and Congress should encourage PHMSA to do it or direct it to eliminate more mechanized exemptions than than S-275 does now. They added an amendment on due process protections. We think they should go a little further on hearings after issuance of a corrective action order, and requiring a separation of functions in PHMSA staff. And one more issue that is in the testimony on leak detection. There's a requirement for a study. We think that's a study on leak detection technologies, which is very complex. We think that's fine. We know PHMSA recently studied this, I think in 2007. But there's an assumption that PHMSA must do a rulemaking even before knowing what the study suggested. We think that should be changed to permissive authority to do the rulemaking on leak detection. First study and figure out if there's something more that should be done.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Weimer?
Yes, we're pretty pleased with Senate Bill 275. It's comprehensive. It covers a number of the issues we have. There's a few things that we think could be done better. There's a need for fees for inspection of new pipelines, and the bill addresses that a little bit, but it only applies to very large pipelines. We think it should be expanded. I think the bill that came out from the administration asked for such fees. We also think there needs to be fees for special permits. That's an area where PHMSA gets spread too thin trying to deal with lots of special permits. And the other area that we really think needs to be expanded is regulation of natural gas gathering lines. Like I said in my testimony, there's hundreds of thousands of miles of those going into places like Texas and Pennsylvania and New York, and a lot of those are unregulated or very much underregulated. So that's an area that needs to be looked at.
We believe the bill is a good bill, and it's been a bill that has really brought in a lot of the stakeholders in the discussion, Mr. Chairman. And it's kind of interesting. You're now hearing the administration, the oil pipeline guys, the Public Safety Trust, and interstate natural gas industry agree that this is a good way for us to go forward. In pages 8 through 12 of my testimony, we have some specific recommendations, and I would probably characterize them more as tweaks as anything else.
Okay.
I think we have a good start.
Thank you. Mr. Dippo?
Yes, likewise, the American Gas Association also believes that this is a good bill for our members. It was a good bipartisan product. A few areas we might recommend some tweaking or changes to. The section on maximum allowable operating pressure seemed to be a bit rushed. We would suggest possibly more time to review how that is written. And the other thing, that seismicity is that section in there is actually already being addressed by operators under subpart O, Part 192, which requires operators in integrity management operations under the preventive and mitigative measures to consider outside forces. So we're not really sure why that came up all of a sudden, but we feel that is already being addressed by its members through the existing regulation.
Mr. Swift?
The NRDC defers to Pipeline Safety Trust on most issues in the Laudenberg bill, but we were very pleased to see that there was a study required of the safety issues and regulatory sufficiency for tar sands crude. We would like to see language that gives PHMSA the authority to act on what they find in that study from a regulatory perspective.
Okay. And Ms. Quarterman, what is the budget for PHMSA?
For the pipeline program?
Yeah, the pipeline.
I don't know the exact number, around $200 million.
How much?
Around $200 million.
200, okay.
To something.
See, my time has expired. Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Quarterman. In my opening statement, I referenced the fact that just yesterday, this subcommittee green-lighted a bill that will short-circuit the review process and force the administration to hastily come to a decision on Keystone XL pipe on the Keystone XL pipeline by November 1. Your agency just recently shut down Keystone 1 pipeline temporarily due to leaks from a pipeline that has been in operation for only 11 months. Can you discuss with the committee the events surrounding the temporary shutdown and eventual restricted opening of the Keystone 1 pipeline, and why did PHMSA initially make the decision to shut down the pipeline and then reverse itself and open it up with restrictions?
This is fairly common practice. in the way we operate on the enforcement side of things. We found a condition that had occurred on 2 occasions with respect to the Keystone Pipeline, both on May the 7th and May the 9th, where there was a leak from a similar component. And in those instances where we think it could be a systematic problem, the regional director puts forward an order telling them they need to shut down and come forward with a plan on how they plan to fix this, not only in these 2 instances, but across the board. In this instance, they came forward with a plan very quickly, and that's why the order was, they got the restart plan, I think, in a day or 2 after that.
What were the conditions?
I will have to get you the details of what the leak related to. I think it was in a pump station. There was a stripping of a valve or something like that.
Is it unusual for a pipeline that has only been in operation for less than a year to have the problems, these problems? Have you ever issued a corrective order for a pipeline that has been in operation for less than a year?
I'm going to have to go back and look at our records to answer that question.
Okay. Does PHMSA have an updated comprehensive plan for transporting diluted bitumen from the Canadian tar sands through the heart of the country as the Keystone Pipeline would do?
There is a requirement in the Senate bill that was passed out, I believe, of committee, that would require PHMSA to do just such a study. We have not done a study on that in the past. If that were to be part of the final bill that came out of this committee and was passed into law, we would certainly be pleased to do that.
All right. Mr. Weimer, the first Keystone Pipeline, which brings Canadian tar sands to refineries in Illinois and Oklahoma, was predicted to spill no more than once every 7 years. However, in just 1 year of operation, it's reported 12 separate oil spills to the NRC, the National Response Center. You are considered an expert on pipeline safety, and your work on pipeline safety issues is known far and wide. And as members of this subcommittee debate the importance of streamlining the permit process while also taking into account safety and environmental concerns, do you advise that we err on the side of safety or expediency? Is there a way to do both? And how should one member who is not necessarily opposed to the pipeline, who's interested in creating more jobs, because I represent a district where there's high unemployment, how should I approach this? From an expedited way? Or should I approach this from a public safety way? Give me some insight on how you would handle this situation.
Right, thank you for the question. The Pipeline Safety Trust always embraces a precautionary principle that tries to answer as many of the questions as possible before you move forward. You know, Keystone 1 has had 12 spills in the last year, which is a lot of spills, although they were all fairly minor, all within pump station areas. We've reviewed the corrective action order from PHMSA and think it was appropriate, and even their backing off, you know, a few days later was appropriate because the company had done what they need to address that system. As far as permitting for Keystone 2, you know, we've joined with a number of national groups questioning, who've done research and have questioned things about the corrosiveness and the abrasiveness of the material moving through those pipelines from the tar sands, and we've asked those questions of PHMSA, and to date, just as Ms. Quarterman said, they have not done that study, so we don't know the answers to those questions. So using a precautionary principle, we would prefer to wait until those questions are answered before that pipeline moves forward. And then we've also heard from EPA just last week that they also didn't know, you know, the toxicity of some of the material used to dilute that bitumen. So there's a number of unanswered questions, and, you know, it's certainly up to the policymakers to decide whether they're big enough questions to allow something like that to move forward or not.
Thank you.
Mr. Upton, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you all, and again, I want to appreciate administrators serving on one panel, particularly with these votes coming on. I want to ask a question of each of you, and again, this goes back to the personal experience of what happened in Michigan last year. Sadly, we had a pipeline break, pretty large spill, and one of the issues that came from that was, as we examined the existing legislation, I want to say that they were supposed to report in a timely manner, and there was some thought that perhaps the notice should have been given quite a bit earlier, and had it been within an hour or so of when it was first discovered, perhaps, and again, there was great response by the first responders, and they a remarkable job. But had they had a little more time, they would have been able to kink the damage and do a much better job long term. Well, it's my understanding that the Senate legislation does not have a specific time frame as to when it has to be reported to the national number. From what happened last year, our former colleague, Mark Schauer, who represented that district, introduced legislation that was 1 hour, I believe, from the time that it had to be reported. That's not in the Senate bill, as I understand it. Would you all, what are your thoughts as to tightening up so that you had to report it nationally within 1 hour so that they, in fact, could be able to get the first responders there on the scene? And maybe we'll start with the administrator and we'll go down the line. And sadly, that's the first buzzer of vote. So I'll make this my only question so I can let his other members speak before 3 o'clock.
Well, I can't speak to the specifics of that particular incident, but as to the broader question of the timeliness of notification, that is one that is obviously of great interest to us, and we have historically required companies to respond within an hour or two of notification. I believe that's in one of our safety advisories, and we would be happy to reconsider whether that is not if that's not long enough or too long. We'd be happy to talk about that further, but certainly we believe that when there is an incident, the emergency responders and we need to know as soon as
your
possible.
office is maintained, the national office is maintained 24/7, right? So if a call comes in at 3 in the morning, somebody's there to physically answer the phone. Is that right?
Not officially, but in reality, yes, that is the case.
Mr. Black?
Operators are supposed to notify the National Response Center within the timelines the administrator said. I understand that in the Marshall, Michigan accident, part of the investigation is what the company went through to identify that there's a leak. We don't have a problem with the existing requirement. We'd ask for the committee's help with the National Response Center. There's two problems with the notification system that cause an inherent tendency to just make sure you've got it right. One is it's difficult to revise the estimate of a release once you make it, and you have to make it right there very quickly, so a company wants to make sure they get it right. And second, you've got to quantify it very specifically. We'd like to be able to report a general range of a liquid release, and that might remove some of the hesitancies. I've not heard that in the Marshall, Michigan accident, but if we could work to improve NRC, National Response Center, regulations there, I think we would improve incident notifications.
We think a response to the National Response Center as fast as possible is good. I don't have a time in mind clearly. I think what most companies are doing is probably adequate. Another important question is how quick either the NRC or the operator themselves contact the actual local first responders, because those are the people that need to hit the ground. I think a bigger question that this brings to from the Michigan spill was why the leak detection system on that pipeline didn't work, and it leaked all night long, that delayed the response to anybody for 10 or 12 hours.
There's a bit of a difference between liquids pipelines and gas pipelines. Our pipes will either leak or they'll rupture, and that could be detected through normal monitoring. So there's a little bit a difference. I would defer to my colleagues and say that as soon as possible is a pretty good standard. We are judged by that. If we have an incident, our regulators come back in and they do review our control room procedures to determine whether we have been responsive or not. In most cases, I think we found to be. The issues for us, obviously, is having an appropriate supervisory control and data acquisition system that identifies the place where the incident may happen, and so we can notify local first responders as well as our own personnel to respond to it. Very proud that our company has put together a fire school in southwestern Pennsylvania, and we have been training local firefighters across Pennsylvania to be able to respond to such emergencies.
I know my time has expired, so I'll just go yes and no, yes or no on for the last two. 1 hour, yes or no?
No. As distribution operators, I would just say that we respond to distribution leaks on a 24/7 basis, 365 days a year, and our concern would be that incidents or that it would overwhelm the NRC Center and PHMSA with calls that are not true emergencies.
NRDC agrees with PSD that as soon as possible.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Waxman, you recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Quarterman, we've seen a terrible string of pipeline accidents over the past year. Is this just a lot of bad luck, or is our pipeline safety system under substantial stress?
I wish I could say one or the other. I mean, I certainly have been greatly concerned by the incidents that have occurred. The fact that all 3 of the incidents have occurred in every part of the pipeline sector, distribution, transmission, and hazardous liquids is of concern, and the fact that they have all been in high consequence areas is one of great concern to me, which is why we have been already undertaking many of the initiatives that are a part of this legislative proposal on the Senate side.
Let me move through some other questions for you. Does your agency have the resources it needs to ensure pipeline safety? And if you had additional resources, would we see fewer explosions and spills?
We have good resources as part of the proposal the administration put forward in 2010. We did request additional resources, and we could certainly use them.
I think your agency is stretched pretty thin. I believe you're directly responsible for about 500,000 miles of pipeline, but you have only 136 employees responsible for inspection and enforcement. That's over 3,500 miles of pipeline per inspector. Mr. Weimar's written testimony identified numerous critical areas where PHMSA needs to issue rules or take other actions. These activities also require resources. In their testimony, Mr. Weimar and Mr. Swift both highlighted safety concern related to pipelines that transport diluted bitumen. Ms. Quarterman, when PHMSA adopted its basic safety requirements, such as establishing maximum operating pressures or setting integrity management requirements, were many U.S. pipelines transporting diluted bitumen, and were any of your regulations developed with the properties of diluted bitumen in mind?
When the integrity management program requirements were first put in place on the hazardous liquid side, I think it was 2000 and 2002, there were pipelines in existence that transport diluted bitumen. I don't believe any study was done at that time of the characteristics of the crude.
Were your regulations developed with the properties of diluted bitumen in mind?
I don't believe it was a part of the equation, no.
Have you received your regulations to assess whether they adequately address any risks specific to diluted bitumen?
We have not done so.
Okay. I was pleased to hear your response to Mr. Rush regarding the requirement in S-275 that PHMSA analyze the safety risks of tar sands crudes. Mr. Swift, why should we be concerned about pipeline safety with respect to diluted bitumen from tar sands?
We've seen many indications that this crude is both more damaging to pipeline systems and potentially more dangerous in the event of a spill. We've done studies of or comparisons of the Albertan pipeline system that moves more of this stuff, in which we found that that system had 16 times as many incidents of internal corrosion per mile. We've seen early indications on the U.S. pipeline system that has been used early to move this stuff. I mean, we've only seen it in the last 10 years really explode by volume.
So not only is it more corrosive, but they may be moved at higher temperatures and pressures.
That's right, and it has
Okay. Mr. Weimer, do we know whether the current pipeline safety statutes are adequate to address the issues Mr. Swift identified with pipelines transporting tar sands?
I don't think we do. As Administrator Quarterman has said, they haven't done that study specifically yet like the Senate bill asks them to do, and there are some questions about the corrosivity and the abrasiveness and the pressure and temperature that need to be answered.
Well, I'm concerned that the industry is changing, but the safety regulations are not keeping up with the changes. That could be a recipe for disaster down the road. Mr. Swift, what steps could Congress take to ensure that pipelines carrying tar sands are properly regulated?
I think the first step is we have to thoroughly examine the nature and magnitude of the risk. And so once we have the science, we can regulate pipelines based on that science. So basically we need a study, and then we need to get a system in place before we build more pipelines to move this.
Mr. Weimar, do you agree? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Gentleman from Texas recognized 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to use all 5 because I know we have a series of votes. First, I just want to welcome Andy Black to the committee. I think most of the senior members remember Andy as a committee staffer back when I was chairman. Before that, he was also my legislative staff director. So it's interesting to see him on the other side of the desk there. My first question is just a general question. Is there anybody here at the table that does not support reauthorization of a pipeline safety bill in this Congress? So everybody is supportive of that. Is everybody supportive of continuing the general policy where we have kind of an interactive, cooperative working arrangement between the regulators and the regulated parties? Is anybody okay with that? Okay. My friend Mr. Waxman just commented on something called diluted bituminum. I think that's a fair question. My physics and chemistry is pretty limited. My engineering degree is about 40 years old now, but my recollection is that there are 3 kinds of items. You have a gas, a liquid, or a solid. Obviously, on pipelines, you're not going to be transporting too many pure solids, but we do have gas pipelines and liquid pipelines. Within those general categories, different liquids, different gases obviously have different characteristics, temperatures, flammability, volatility, viscosity, things like that. But is there any reason, Mr. Black, to feel that this diluted bituminum is of such a special nature that it requires special regulations?
No, it's a heavy crude when it's moved through the pipelines. The bitumen is mixed with a condensate before it's a pipeline quality transportation. That's like a heavy crude from California, Venezuela, and other oil sands. Diluted bitumen has been moved through pipelines for many years. There's a FERC tariff about elements of sediment and water that TransCanada Keystone XL would have to live up to. There are corrosion regulations implemented by PHMSA that Keystone XL will have to live up to. While there's not been a formal study by the administration, this has been a part of the multi-agency review process. There were many special conditions proposed for TransCanada by PHMSA. None of these deal with this idea that there's some incremental corrosiveness in the product. It's a heavy crude.
Okay. I want the record to show that I did not pre-clear that question with Mr. Black, but it sounds like he knew I was going to ask him the question. That was a very thoughtful answer. Administrator Quarterman, do you generally share the view that Mr. Black just proposed to the committee?
Well, I don't believe that I'm in a position to opine. My engineering degree is not quite as old as yours, but it sounds like you remember more than I do. I would defer to any studies that might be performed by our agency on answering that question.
I think it is something, Mr. Chairman, we need to look into, but I don't think it's definitive or determinative that one thing should stop a reauthorization bill. With that, I would yield back to the chair.
Thank you. We do have 24 votes on the House floor, and what we're going to do, we're going to try to give everybody here an opportunity to ask questions. So, Mr. Green, we're going to go to you, and then Mr. Olson, and then Mr. Inslee, because I don't want you to hang around for 2.5 hours or so. Mr. Green, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be as quick as I can. I have a district in Houston and East Harris County. I've never not lived on a pipeline. And I've noticed during my lifetime how much it's so much better in what we're getting. And I have a house now that we on a regular occasion get contacts from our pipeline safety state agencies, obviously the federal agencies. So our reauthorizations over my career on this committee has been thorough, and I hope this one would be the same thing. Let me go quickly. So, Ms. Quarterman, I want to applaud you and the Secretary for addressing the issue of pipeline safety head on. There's a national dialogue on pipeline safety because that's probably the most #1 issue in the district I represent because we live and work there. Pipelines are much safer than having them run down the road on a tank truck, but we have plenty of tank trucks too. What kind of responses have you heard or received from industry and others for when you rolled out your call for action?
The responses have been very positive. I mean, the Secretary and I met with the leaders of several companies, presidents, and sat down and told them we wanted to have a conversation. We wanted to all work together, bring all the constituents together, and try to figure out how we might move forward with our agenda. We just had a meeting yesterday out near Dulles. We are in the midst, working with our technical advisory committees, of putting together a report to America about the current status of pipeline safety in this country and how we might move that ball forward. So everything's been positive so far.
Can you explain when NEPA's triggered? I know that was a concern from Ranking Member Waxman, and when NEPA is triggered from your office.
We are not involved with the Keystone XL project or the NEPA analysis. We are not performing that NEPA analysis. It's being led by the Department of State. I don't know if that's where you're going to.
Okay. And I understand that if you have more corrosive going through a pipeline than some other substance, you just have to make sure you inspect it a lot more, and you check it, because meteorology is something that's been done for decades. Mr. Black, you decided, if Congress decides to expand the PHMSA's reach on the offshore gathering pipelines, what are your concerns? And my understanding that these gathering lines may not be large enough to use smart pigs.
Right. Gatherings generally intrastate can be regulated by the states. If it's on the OCS, it can be regulated by Interior. Like you said, Congressman, these are small lines, maybe 2 inches to 8 inches in diameter, operating at low stress. Some of these are marginally economic or serving marginally economic wells. Depending on what PHMSA would do with regulations, it could result in some shut-in supply.
Well, and I know because shallow well drilling, you do have marginal wells, ones that may not be big, although our committee was actually on a rig in deep water, and those pipelines from that deep water, as a Chevron rig off Louisiana, actually were big enough because they had enough production, 110,000 barrels a day, you could have that. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it, and I'd like to yield what I have left to my colleague from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Green. First, I want to thank Mr. Weimer for your leadership. I think of Leanne Wood and Wade King and Stephen Tesoris. We appreciate your leadership. Quick question for Ms. Quarterman. The information we have today and others has suggested that there's some viable concern about this relatively new product from the tar sands and what risks it may or may not present. Doesn't it make sense from a first do no harm sense for us to have a sophisticated, analytical, objective analysis of this particular product before we decide what the appropriate maintenance systems and inspection systems are?
I would have to leave that up to Congress in terms of whether or not you would like to legislate such a requirement. I don't want to get into the Department of State's jurisdiction in terms of whether or not to approve this project or not. I'm going to leave it with them to make give an opinion about it.
I'm not thinking of just this, whether or not to approve this particular project. The issue is, shouldn't we have an objective assessment of the corrosive properties and perhaps new maintenance requirements for this or any other line, just as a matter of national policy? Don't we really need that from your agency?
Well, our agency is not really involved until a pipeline has been permitted. The Secretary has gone around and said quite a bit about the fact that we have a bit of a patchwork here in that the FERC, for example, is responsible for deciding on whether or not a gas pipeline will be approved, and we only come in after the fact. On the oil side, the only time there is any oversight on whether a pipeline will be put in the ground is if it crosses international boundaries, and that's the case with respect to Keystone XL. Otherwise, there is no federal regulatory review or approval of putting a pipeline in the ground. So that's a broader question, I think, for the committee about how that works and whether it makes sense.
We ask what to do. Thank you.
Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair for his exceptional courtesy and want to welcome the witnesses and thank you for coming and giving us your time and your expertise. First of all, I want to just start by giving some of my perspectives as a representative of Texas 22. No one here in Congress cares more about pipeline safety than Congressman Pete Olson does. I represent Texas 22, which is part of the energy capital of the United States, and we're Texans. It's actually the energy capital of the world. And we have this tremendous petrochemical facilities along the Port of Houston, which is the largest tonnage and gross to international tonnage in America. And the pipeline infrastructure that supports the port and those petrochemical industry is critical to our economy, not only in Southeast Texas, but the entire country. But not only are the pipelines part of our economy, they're a part of our quality of life. And just an example of that is about a mile from my house in Sugar Land, Texas, is Sugar Land Memorial Park, and right next to that is the University of Houston Sugar Land. These are fairly new facilities built in the last 10 years. I take my dog Riley walking through the park every day I'm home, and they are built right on a natural gas pipeline which runs right through the middle of them. Again, very, very safe. And since I've joined Energy and Commerce, I've spent a lot of my time when I'm back home talking to some of the pipeline operators just to get up to speed on what they're doing and what their safety is like. And one great privilege I have representing this district is I also represent the Johnson Space Center, home of NASA Mission Control. And I can tell you, I can assure you that having seen Mission Control on the inside and having seen the control room for these pipeline operations, it's very hard to tell which one is which. I mean, the technology is amazing. I mean, one pipeline, one company I toured had pipelines all across the northeastern part of the United States with the control room right there in Houston, Texas. They had an automatic system. If there was a drop in pressure somewhere between all the little terminals they have, automatically downstream it would be shut off. They had a man, just in case the system didn't work. A man was there, a human being watching, monitoring the system, who could hit a button and shut it off from Houston, Texas. It's just an amazing, amazing amount of safety that these pipeline companies have, and I think the American people deserve to know that. And I know we all agree that there should be zero pipeline incidents. That should be our goal. But again, I'm concerned about some of the things we're talking about doing here from a regulatory perspective. And my first question, it's going to be for Mr. Black and Mr. Dippo, and I'd like to get comments from you, Administrator Quarterman. But as I understand it right now, the determination of what is considered a high consequence area is risk-based. Makes sense. If all pipeline miles, all of them, are considered under HCA standards, wouldn't that diminish the focus of where we should be focusing? I mean, where a release truly has a greater consequence? Population centers, unusually sensitive areas, environmental areas, drinking water intakes, wildlife refuges, my home in Sugar Land, mile and a half from a pipeline. I mean, shouldn't that pervade as opposed to making that standard all across the country? And again, Mr. Black, you want to take a shot at that?
Well, we think it's right to have high consequence areas, and Congress and PHMSA are right to implement them that way. It would divert the focus on those areas of highest consequence if the integrity management areas were going to be expanded. Operators do a lot on the areas of a pipeline beyond high consequence areas, and there are a lot of federal regulations that require that. There are voluntary assessments of those areas outside of a high consequence area, but you don't follow the same rigid repair criteria that you do inside. So we think it's right to keep the focus on a high consequence area. Yes, sir.
Yeah, not expanding all across the country.
Right.
High consequence areas are high consequence areas. Mr. Dippo, care to comment, sir?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Mr. Black said. And in addition, I would just like to indicate that, as an operator in New Jersey, being the most densely populated state, our state regulatory commission has looked at it from that perspective and has regulated and asked us to look at more than just high consequence areas. But that's specific to our state and our operations in New Jersey. So I don't believe and I don't think that it should be applied across the board. In certain areas, yes, but other than that, no.
Yes, sir. I got 26 seconds. Administrator Quarterman, would you like to make a comment, ma'am?
Yes, we have a pending rulemaking asking a question regarding this, and there are two ways to think of this. One is whether or not the definition of a high consequence area is adequate as it stands. There have been some incidents that occurred recently where it was obvious to me it was a high consequence area because there was spills in a large body of water, except it wasn't clear when we were trying to figure out, was this in fact a high consequence area? So I think we have to make sure that the definition is adequate. The second is that in terms of dealing with high risk areas first, I think that is absolutely appropriate. However, that doesn't mean that the remaining areas could not also be assessed perhaps on a longer time period, something like that. I think those are things that we are considering and want to discuss further.
Yes, ma'am. If I could just sum up, the people in my district want a high consequence area to be a high consequence area. I appreciate my time. Yield back the 43 seconds that I'm over.
That concludes today's hearing. We actually had other questions we wanted to ask, but as I said, we've got these 20-some votes on the floor and a motion to recommit. So we look forward to working with all of you as we move forward with a reauthorization legislation. Thank you for your time and your input, and this hearing is concluded. And the record will remain open for 10 days for any additional material to be inserted.